August 2nd, 1943. The Blackett Strait is a scar of black ink under a moonless sky. The PT-109 boat glides with its engines, rumbling just above a whisper, its wooden hull vibrating with contained energy. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy scans the darkness, his hands gripping the wheel. Suddenly, a silhouette darker than the night itself emerges from the mist. The Japanese destroyer Amagiri, cutting through the waters at full speed. There is no time to evade, only for impact. A tearing crunch of splintered wood, the stench of gasoline, the cold shock of the Pacific water. In a matter of seconds, the 77-foot boat, designed to hunt giants, is rammed and split in two by the very colossus it sought to stalk. This is not just the story of a sinking, but the story of how these small wooden vessels, against all odds, became the scourge of the most formidable navy in the Pacific. The story of the PT boats, patrol torpedo, does not begin in the jungles of the South Pacific, but in the cold waters of the English Channel during the First World War. The threat of fast and lethal German torpedo boats, the Schnellboot, had left a deep impression on naval strategists. These small, fast vessels, armed with torpedoes, demonstrated that even the most powerful battleship could be vulnerable to a swift and stealthy attack. In the interwar period, this lesson was internalized by visionary officers, like then-Commander John Bulkley, who tirelessly advocated for the development of an American torpedo boat fleet. He argued that in a future conflict against an expansionist naval power like Japan, the United States would need a cheap, agile, and numerous weapon capable of operating in the confines of archipelagos and defending coastlines. The design that finally emerged was the 77-foot Elko class, built not of steel, but of mahogany and fir plywood. This choice was not a whim, but a strategic decision. The wood gave them exceptional top speed over 40 knots, and crucially, made them nearly undetectable by the primitive radar of the era. Their low profile and narrow silhouette made them difficult targets to spot visually at night, their natural realm. They were, in essence, ghosts made of wood and pure speed. However, their acceptance within the U.S. naval establishment was not straightforward. The big navy of battleships and aircraft carriers, the dreadnoughts, dominated doctrine and budget. Many old guard admirals saw PT boats as expensive toys, brass pounders, whose utility in an open-sea naval battle was questionable. They were the antithesis of traditional naval power, small, vulnerable, and lacking the armor that defined a true warship. It was only the desperate urgency following the attack on Pearl Harbor and the rapid Japanese advances in the Pacific that gave them their chance. Suddenly, the United States desperately needed any boat that could float and carry a weapon, especially one that could operate from rudimentary outposts and harass an enemy navy that seemed unstoppable. The Mosquito Fleet was about to enter the war, and it would find its perfect trial by fire among the countless islands of the Solomons. The desperate need for any naval advantage had granted the Mosquito Fleet its chance. But to understand how these wooden craft could dare challenge steel leviathans, one must step aboard and examine the unique fusion of speed, firepower, and fragility that defined their very being. Was a masterpiece of martial minimalism, a vessel where every ounce and every inch was dedicated to a single purpose, striking fast and escaping faster. Its heart was its power plant, 3 monstrous Packard marine engines, each a 12-cylinder behemoth, capable of producing over 1,300 horsepower. The sound of these engines starting was a roar that could shake the very docks, a promise of blistering speed. When all 3 were opened to full throttle, the boat would plane on the water, its hull rising until only a fraction of the wood touched the surface, allowing it to reach speeds in excess of 40 knots. This velocity was its primary defense, a shield of wake and spray. But speed was useless without teeth, and the PT boat's bite was formidable. Its main offensive weapons were a quartet of Mark 8 torpedoes, each weighing over a ton and carrying a 500-pound explosive charge. These were launched from sleek steel tubes mounted on deck, capable of being aimed by pointing the entire boat at its target, a terrifyingly intimate form of naval gunnery. For closer encounters, the boats carried an ever-evolving and increasingly heavy suite of guns. Early models might have only light machine guns, but as the war progressed, they became floating arsenals. Twin 50-caliber Browning machine guns in power turrets, 20mm Oerlikon cannons, and even 37mm anti-tank guns were welded to their decks. Some later models, dubbed PT gunboats, carried a 40mm Bofors cannon, a weapon that could shred Japanese barges and coastal installations. The environment for the crew of 12 to 14 men was one of constant exposure and extreme tension. There was no armored citadel, no safe haven below decks. The crew lived and fought in the open, surrounded by highly flammable 100-octane aviation fuel stored in tanks just beneath their feet. The smell of gasoline, salt water, and sweat was the pervasive perfume of their existence. The boat's wooden construction, while offering speed and low radar signature, was a death sentence in any direct confrontation. A single shell from a destroyer's 5-inch gun could vaporize the entire vessel. A strafing run from a Zero could turn the deck into a slaughterhouse. They were, as one sailor put it, shooting from a glass house. Their survival depended on stealth, surprise, and the sheer audacity to attack giants with a slingshot, vanishing back into the darkness before the enemy could even properly aim. The PT boats found their strategic purpose in countering one of the most ingenious and relentless Japanese operations of the Guadalcanal campaign. The Tokyo Express. This was not a single ship, but a nightly shuttle service of destroyers and fast transports that ran down the slot, the long channel through the Solomon Islands, to deliver fresh troops, supplies, and artillery bombardments to the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. These warships, often veteran destroyers like the Akizuki class, were larger, faster in a straight line, and infinitely more powerful than any PT boat. They were the giants. The American Mosquitoes were born to sting. The American naval strategy was straightforward but incredibly dangerous. Use the PT boats as a picket line to intercept the Tokyo Express before it could reach Guadalcanal. The boats would lie in wait in the dark coves and channels of islands like Savo and Russell, their engines silent, their crews listening for the distant rumble of Japanese engines. The tactics were those of the ambush. They would let the Japanese destroyers pass on their way in, hoping to catch them on the return trip, when they might be less alert. The ideal attack was to get close, dangerously close, within 1,000 yards fire a full spread of 4 torpedoes, and then immediately lay a smokescreen and flee at top speed, zigzagging to avoid the inevitable storm of shellfire. The reality of these engagements was a chaotic, terrifying ballet of fire and shadows. The night would be split by the blinding flashes of Japanese searchlights and the fiery trails of incendiary shells arcing towards the small wooden targets. The PT boats would respond with their own tracers, the red lines of their 50-caliber rounds stitching through the darkness in a desperate attempt to blind the searchlights and suppress the enemy. Gunners, the roar of the Packard engines, the crack of the Oerlikons, and the deafening detonation of Japanese shells hitting the water created a sensory overload that tested the nerves of the most seasoned sailors. A successful attack was rare and hard to confirm in the confusion, but even a failed interception served a purpose. It harassed the enemy, disrupted their schedule, and forced them to take evasive action, buying precious time and causing psychological attrition. The Tokyo Express was the anvil upon which the PT boat doctrine was forged, a brutal school that taught them how to fight a naval war unlike any other. Forged in the fiery crucible of the Tokyo Express, the PT boats were no longer an experiment. They were a proven, if unorthodox, weapon system. Now, they would evolve from a defensive picket line into a true hunter-killer force, mastering the art of war in darkness. The true baptism of fire for American PT boats in the Pacific occurred not in the open ocean, but in the confined, treacherous waters of the Philippine Islands during the desperate early days of the war. As General Douglas MacArthur's forces retreated towards Bataan and Corregidor, a small squadron of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, under the command of the relentless Lieutenant John Bulkley, became the lifeline and the only offensive naval force available. These boats, operating with audacious bravery, conducted a series of raids against the Japanese invasion fleet, striking at transports and warships anchored off the coast. While their torpedoes often proved frustratingly unreliable, their sheer audacity inflicted psychological damage and demonstrated the potential of these small craft to harass a powerful enemy. The most legendary mission of this period was one not of attack, but of evacuation. As the situation on Bataan became hopeless, President Roosevelt ordered General MacArthur to be extracted to avoid his capture. The mission fell to Bulkley and his 4 remaining PT boats. On the night of March 11, 1942, MacArthur, his family, and his staff boarded the perilously overloaded PT-41 for a desperate dash through 500 miles of Japanese-controlled waters. The voyage was a nightmare of stormy seas, near constant mechanical troubles, and the ever-present threat of discovery by Japanese patrols. Through a combination of superb seamanship and sheer luck, the mission succeeded. MacArthur's famous promise, "I shall return," was delivered from the deck of a PT boat, forever linking these vessels with one of the war's most powerful symbolic moments and proving their value in special operations. While the Philippines ultimately fell, the actions of Bulkley's squadron provided the United States with something invaluable: proof of concept. The boats had demonstrated they could operate far behind enemy lines, sustain themselves with minimal support, and complete missions deemed impossible for larger vessels. The crews learned hard lessons about maintenance in tropical conditions, the limitations of their torpedoes, and the tactics needed to survive against a dominant enemy. These hard-won experiences were analyzed and formed the foundation for the training and doctrine of the dozens of new PT boat squadrons being built and deployed. To the Solomon Islands. The first blood, drawn in the Philippines, though paid for with the loss of boats and men, had secured the future of the Mosquito Fleet, ensuring it would have a central role in the long road back through the Pacific. In the Solomon Islands, the PT boat war evolved into a distinct form of naval warfare, one governed by the rules of the jungle and the absolute tyranny of darkness. The Americans did not own the daylight, where Japanese aircraft ruled the skies. Instead, the PT boats claimed the night. Their tactics became those of the ambush predator. They would hide by day in camouflaged bases carved into the mangrove swamps of islands like Tulagi and Rendova, their hulls draped with nets and foliage. As dusk fell, they would slink out into the channels, their engines a low murmur, becoming one with the shadows. The key to successful night fighting was advanced and often improvised technology. Radar was the great equalizer. The early SO radar sets, with their distinctive bed spring antennae, could detect a large ship at several miles, giving the PT boats a critical few minutes of warning and positioning. This electronic eye allowed them to set up perfect ambushes. They would wait patiently, tracking the unsuspecting Japanese destroyer or transport as it steamed down the slot, calculating its speed and course. The ideal firing solution was to attack from the darkness, perpendicular to the target's path, unleashing a full spread of torpedoes into its side. But technology could fail, and the human senses became paramount. Lookouts were trained to peer into the gloom, identifying the subtle silhouette of a Japanese warship against the faint starlight. Crews learned to distinguish the sound of a Mitsubishi bomber from a friendly Catalina and the deep-throated rumble of a Japanese destroyer's turbines from any other engine noise. They fought in a world of sudden, violent contrasts, the utter silence of the wait, broken by the roar of engines and the shriek of shells. The pitch black of the tropical night, ripped apart by the blinding white of a searchlight or the orange fireball of an explosion. They were hunters in a pitch-black forest, where every sense was stretched to its limit, and a single mistake, a moment of misidentification, a hesitation at the wheel, a radar glitch meant not just a lost battle, but a lost boat and a lost crew. They had become the masters of the dark, and the Japanese, for all their naval prowess, were learning to fear what lurked in the moonless nights of the South Pacific. The night hunters had perfected their tactics of stealth and ambush, but their primary weapon, the tool meant to slay giants, was proving to be tragically flawed. The very reason for the PT boat's existence, its torpedoes, was becoming its greatest liability, forcing a dramatic and violent evolution in its very nature. For the first 2 years of the war, the American PT boat crews fought with a secret shame. Their most powerful weapons were dangerously unreliable. The standard Mark 8 torpedo, a design dating back to the 1920s, was plagued by a cascade of crippling defects that turned what should have been kill shots into humiliating and costly failures. Crews would risk everything to get within 1,000 yards of a massive Japanese cruiser, fire a full spread of 4 torpedoes, and watch in fury and disbelief as nothing happened. The problems were systemic and deadly. The most infamous issue was the Mark 6 exploder, a magnetic influence detonator designed to explode beneath a ship's keel, breaking its back. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it was a catastrophe. The mechanism was so sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field at different latitudes that it often detonated prematurely, far from the target, or failed to detonate at all. Even when it functioned, the ship's magnetic field could trigger the torpedo just before impact, causing a harmless splash instead of a devastating explosion. Compounding this was the contact exploder, a simple firing pin that was too fragile. When a torpedo struck a target at the perfect 90-degree angle, the pin often bent or sheared without detonating the warhead. The crew of the PT boat would see their torpedo strike the enemy hull with a solid thud, only to see it bounce off and sink harmlessly. The depth control mechanism was another critical failure. The torpedoes were programmed to run at a specific depth, but faulty manufacturing and poor calibration often sent them running 10 or even 15 feet deeper than set. A torpedo meant to strike the side of a destroyer would instead pass silently beneath its hull. The cumulative effect of these failures was a devastating blow to morale. Crews who had braved storms of shellfire to deliver their attack felt betrayed by their own technology. After-action reports are filled with frustrated entries. Torpedoes fired. No results observed. It took the courage of frontline officers and crews who risked court-martial by disassembling and modifying the faulty mechanisms themselves to finally force the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance to acknowledge the problems. The solution, when it finally came, was to disable the magnetic feature entirely and reinforce the contact pins. A crude but effective fix that came far too late for many of the early heroes of the Mosquito Fleet. Their faith in their primary weapon shattered. The PT boat crews were forced to adapt, turning to other means to wage their war. Frustrated by the failure of their torpedoes and faced with a shifting enemy strategy, the PT boat squadrons underwent a radical transformation. They began to shed their identity as torpedo boats and evolved into something far more brutal and versatile: gunboats. This was not a change dictated by high command, but an organic, frontline adaptation born of necessity. As the Japanese increasingly used small, wooden-hulled barges to reinforce their island garrisons, a target against which a torpedo was useless, the PT boats had to find a new way to fight. The metamorphosis was physical and dramatic. The sleek, uncluttered decks of the early warboats disappeared under a jungle of welded steel and heavy weaponry. The two lightweight, 50-caliber machine gun turrets were often replaced by a single, powerful powered turret housing twin, 50-caliber guns. The real game-changer was the addition of automatic cannons. A 37mm anti-tank gun, scavenged from the Army, was mounted on the bow. Its solid shot, capable of punching clean through a barge, and the troops crowded inside. On the stern, a 40mm Bofors cannon, a weapon normally found on destroyers and larger, became a common sight. Its rapid pom-pom-pom sound, signaling the end for any Japanese landing craft. This new role demanded new tactics. The barge-busting mission was a close-quarters, merciless form of warfare. The PT boats would hunt their prey in the shallow coastal waters, using their speed to run down the slow, vulnerable barges. They would open fire with everything they had, raking the waterline with 50-caliber rounds, shattering hulls with the 37mm, and finishing the job with the high-explosive shells of the 40mm. The effect was horrific and decisive. The barges, often packed with 50 or more Japanese soldiers, would be torn apart, their human cargo spilled into the dark, shark-infested waters. It was grim, brutal work, but it was strategically vital, strangling the Japanese supply chain and isolating their island garrisons. The PT boat had been reinvented. No longer just a nuisance to capital ships, it had become the master of the littorals, a swift and deadly guardian of the islands, proving that even when its primary weapon failed, its capacity for innovation and violence was limitless. The evolution into gunboats had given the PT fleet a new lease on life, but the inherent vulnerability of their wooden hulls remained. In the pitch-black waters of the Solomon Islands, that vulnerability could be exploited in an instant, turning a routine patrol into a fight for survival and birthing a legend that would transcend the war itself. The night of August 1st, 1943, was typical for the PT boats operating in the New Georgia campaign. Moonless, humid, and thick with tension. A group of 15 boats was dispatched to intercept the Tokyo Express, expected to run through the Blackett Strait on a resupply mission to the Japanese garrison on Vila. Among them was PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy. The boats fanned out, their engines cut, lying in wait like spiders in a web. But the Japanese, aware of the PT threat, had altered their tactics. The destroyer Amagiri, a veteran of many naval battles, was not running a supply mission. It was on a high-speed offensive sweep, tasked specifically with hunting and destroying the PT boats. What followed was not a battle, but a brutal accident of war. The Amagiri, its sharp bow cutting through the water at over 30 knots, emerged from the darkness without warning. For the crew of PT-109, the first sight of the destroyer was a towering black mass already upon them. Kennedy, at the helm, had mere seconds to react. He slammed the throttles forward, but it was too late. The Amagiri's steel bow sliced through the PT boat's wooden hull just behind the starboard side, the impact shearing the 80-foot boat clean in two. The violent collision killed 2 of the 13 crewmen instantly. The forward section, still miraculously afloat, was engulfed in the sickening smell of seawater and raw gasoline from the ruptured fuel tanks. The aftermath was a scene of utter devastation and slow-burning terror. The 2 sections of the wreckage, now separated, began to sink. The surviving 11 crewmen, including Kennedy, found themselves clinging to the floating bow section in the middle of a hostile strait. They were stranded, with no means of communication, in waters patrolled by the Japanese and known for sharks. As dawn approached, they faced an impossible choice: stay with the wreckage and risk discovery, or attempt to reach one of the small, seemingly deserted islands on the horizon. The disaster in the Blackett Strait was a stark reminder of the PT boat's fundamental fragility. In the blink of an eye, the hunter had become the prey, and a routine patrol had become a desperate struggle for survival against the sea, the enemy, and time itself. With the wreckage of PT-109 sinking beneath them, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy took command of a situation that seemed hopeless. He rallied his 10 surviving crewmen and pointed them toward the faint outline of Plum Pudding Island, several miles away. Despite a severe back injury, sustained in the collision, Kennedy spent the next 5 hours in the water, towing a badly burned engineer by clutching the man's life jacket strap in his teeth as he swam. This act of sheer willpower set the tone for the next 6 days. The men reached the small, uninhabited island, but it offered no food, little fresh water, and no salvation. They were exposed, starving, and dehydrating under the brutal Sunday. Knowing they could not stay, Kennedy made a series of desperate gambles. He and his executive officer, Ensign Leonard Tom, took turns swimming into the Ferguson Passage, a major Japanese shipping lane, hoping to flag down a passing American PT boat on patrol. They spent hours treading water in the dangerous currents, only to see the distant silhouettes of their own squadron pass by in the darkness, unseen and unheard. On one of these exhausting and fruitless swims, Kennedy was swept away by a powerful current, nearly drowning before washing up half dead on a different island. His refusal to give up, even in the face of certain death, became the glue that held his crew together. Their salvation came not from the sea, but from the islands. 2 native Solomon Islanders, Byuku Gasa and Ironi Kumana, who were working as coast watchers for the Allies, discovered the exhausted and emaciated Americans. In a moment of incredible trust, Kennedy carved a message into a coconut shell. Nauro Isel, Commander, native knows posit, he can pilot, 11 alive, need small boat, Kennedy, the coast watchers. Carried this message through dangerous territory to an Australian officer, who relayed it to the U.S. Navy. Days after they were presumed lost, a PT boat finally slipped into the lagoon and rescued Kennedy and his entire crew. The ordeal was over, but its legacy was just beginning. Kennedy's leadership and personal courage became the stuff of legend, a story that would be told and retold, eventually propelling him from a naval officer to an American president. The saga of PT-109 became the most famous story of the entire PT boat war, a powerful narrative of survival that, for many, came to define the very spirit of the Mosquito Fleet. While the saga of PT-109 captured the public's imagination, the daily reality for most PT boat squadrons was a grueling, unglamorous war of attrition against the Japanese logistical backbone, a war fought not against destroyers, but against barges, and one that would prove decisive in strangling enemy strongholds. By mid-1943, the strategic picture in the Solomons had shifted. The Tokyo Express, though still running, was no longer the primary threat. Instead, the Japanese resorted to a more rudimentary but resilient supply system, a massive fleet of diesel-powered, wooden-hulled landing barges. These slow, ungainly vessels, each capable of carrying up to 100 troops or several tons of supplies, would creep along the coastlines, under cover of darkness, hopping from island to island to reinforce garrisons bypassed by the American island-hopping campaign. They were an elusive and critical target, and the PT boats, with their speed and shallow draft, were the only weapon that could effectively hunt them. This barge-busting war was a brutal, close-range affair that bore little resemblance to the torpedo attacks on capital ships. The PT boats, now heavily armed as gunboats, would patrol the labyrinthine coastlines and narrow straits, their radar scouting for the small, slow-moving contacts that indicated a barge convoy. The attack was a violent, point-blank execution. The boat would race in at high speed, its crew at battle stations. At a range of sometimes less than 200 yards, every weapon on the PT boat would open up simultaneously. The twin, 50-caliber machine guns would hose down the barge's deck, suppressing any troops attempting to return fire with rifles and light machine guns. Then, the heavier weapons would speak. The 37mm gun on the bow would fire armor-piercing rounds, punching neat, fatal holes through the barge's hull at the waterline. The 40mm Bofors on the stern would lob high-explosive shells, tearing the wooden vessel apart in a storm of splinters. The aftermath was often horrific. A successful attack would leave the barge shattered, sinking, and the water around it filled with struggling Japanese soldiers. The PT boat would typically make another pass, its gunners firing into the water to eliminate survivors, a grim but tactically necessary act. This was savage, merciless warfare, fought night after night. The psychological toll on the young American crews was immense. They were no longer engaging a faceless warship at a distance. They were witnessing the direct and bloody consequences of their firepower. Yet, they understood the strategic necessity. Every barge sunk meant a company of enemy soldiers that would not reach the front lines, a battery of artillery shells that would not fall on American positions. It was a war of logistical strangulation, and the PT boats were the garrote, slowly but surely squeezing the life out of the Japanese island defenses. As General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area Command began its long return to the Philippines, the PT boats found a new and powerful patron. MacArthur, who owed his own survival to a PT boat, was a fervent believer in their utility. He saw them as the perfect tool for his unique operational needs, a navy that could operate in the shallow, confined waters of the New Guinea coast and the countless islands of the Dutch East Indies, where his larger warships were vulnerable to air attack and restricted by deep water. The PT boat squadrons assigned to him became, in effect, MacArthur's private navy. In this theater, the missions were incredibly diverse. The boats continued their barge-busting duties with a vengeance, decimating Japanese coastal supply routes along the northern coast of New Guinea. But they also took on roles far beyond their original design. They landed Australian commandos and American reconnaissance troops behind enemy lines on countless secret missions, using their speed and stealth to insert and extract special forces units without detection. They conducted photo reconnaissance of enemy-held beaches and harbors, darting in, taking pictures, and racing away under fire. They served as rescue vessels for downed Allied airmen, often plucking pilots from the water just miles from Japanese shore batteries. One of their most vital and dangerous tasks was supporting MacArthur's leapfrogging amphibious assaults. While the main invasion fleet stood offshore, the PT boats would operate inshore, protecting the flanks of the landing force from Japanese counterattacks by sea. They would set up picket lines to intercept any enemy barges or destroyers, attempting to reinforce the beachhead, fighting intense, close-range battles in the glare of star shells and burning landing craft. MacArthur's faith in them was absolute. He provided them with priority intelligence, and his command structure gave them unprecedented autonomy. The PT boats repaid that faith by becoming the ubiquitous, multi-role workhorses of his campaign. They were his eyes, his raiding force, his rescue service, and his coastal shield, proving that in the complex, island-dotted battleground of the Southwest Pacific, no conventional warship could match the flexibility and sheer audacity of the Mosquito Fleet. The PT boats had proven their tactical and strategic worth from the Solomons to the Philippines. But their impact extended far beyond sunk tonnage and disrupted supply lines. They had carved a unique psychological space in the war, becoming symbols of American ingenuity and tenacity, even as they paid a steep price for their daring. The true power of the PT boat lay as much in the realm of perception as in physical destruction. For the Japanese, these devil boats became a source of profound frustration and psychological attrition. The Imperial Japanese Navy, built around the doctrine of the decisive fleet battle between capital ships, had no prepared counter for these swift, elusive pests that refused to fight by the established rules. The constant gnawing threat they posed was exhausting. A Japanese destroyer captain, tasked with a high-speed troop run, could never be certain if the dark waters ahead concealed a spread of torpedoes. The psychological strain of navigating the slot, at night, knowing that an invisible enemy could strike from any direction, eroded morale and combat efficiency. For Allied forces and the American public, the PT boat became an potent symbol. In the early, dark days of the war, when defeat seemed imminent, stories of these small boats, taking the fight to the enemy, provided a crucial narrative of defiance and hope. They were the underdogs, David against the Japanese Goliath. The dramatic saga of John F. Kennedy and PT-109, later brilliantly publicized, cemented this image in the national consciousness. Here was a story not of impersonal battleship broadsides, but of individual courage, leadership, and survival, a deeply human story that resonated powerfully. The PT boatman became a new kind of American folk hero, the technical wizard, the daring individualist, fighting a modern war with a touch of the buccaneer's spirit. This psychological warfare extended to the tactical level. The very presence of PT boats in an area forced the Japanese to alter their strategies. They had to dedicate destroyers to anti-PT boat sweeps instead of more offensive roles. They switched from efficient destroyer runs to the slower, more vulnerable barge traffic, significantly hampering their logistics. The PT boats, though small, created a defensive perimeter that stretched far beyond their physical reach. They injected uncertainty and delay into every Japanese naval operation in the constrained waters of the island campaigns. They were a weapon that attacked the enemy's mind as surely as it attacked his ships, proving that in modern warfare, psychological dominance could be as critical as firepower. The glory of the PT boat service was etched in sacrifice. Their tactical successes came at an exceptionally high cost. The very attributes that made them effective, Their small size, wooden construction, and aggressive, close-range tactics made them devastatingly vulnerable. A single hit from a 5-inch shell was almost always fatal. A near miss from a heavy bomb could smash their hulls. Collisions, groundings, and catastrophic engine failures were constant dangers in the treacherous island waters they called home. The casualty rates tell a stark story. Of the 531 PT boats built during the war, around 69 were lost to all causes, a loss ratio of roughly 13%. A staggering figure for a naval vessel. Many of these losses were total, with few or no survivors. The crew of a PT boat lived with the intimate knowledge that there was no abandoned ship drill that offered much hope. If their boat was destroyed, they were likely to be killed in the explosion, burned by the spreading gasoline fire, or left stranded in hostile waters. The story of PT 109 was a famous exception precisely because anyone survived at all. The human toll extended beyond the stark numbers of the lost. The conditions were relentless. Crews faced constant sleep deprivation from night patrols, the physical exhaustion of maintaining the temperamental high-performance engines, and the pervasive fear of a sudden, violent end in the dark. They suffered from tropical diseases, malnutrition from poor rations, and the deep psychological strain of cumulative combat stress. For every dramatic torpedo attack, there were 100 nights of tense, boring patrols, each moment stretched thin with the anticipation of sudden violence. The cost of courage was paid nightly, not just in blood, but in the slow wearing down of nerve and spirit. A price exacted from the young men who dared to go out in boats made of wood to fight a navy made of steel. With the end of the Second World War, the brief, brilliant era of the PT boat effectively closed. Jet aircraft and advanced radar made their stealth by wood technology obsolete. The few remaining boats were quickly scrapped or sold, and the vast squadrons were disbanded. For decades, their story was overshadowed by the larger narratives of carrier battles and amphibious landings. They became a nostalgic footnote, remembered mostly for the Kennedy connection. However, their tactical and strategic legacy proved enduring. The PT boat was the direct ancestor of the modern fast attack craft. The lessons learned in the Solomons, the value of small, fast, heavily armed boats operating in confined waters, were studied by navies around the world. The Soviet Komar-class missile boat, which famously sank the Israeli destroyer Eilat in 1967, was a spiritual successor to the PT boat, applying the same principle of using a small, cheap platform to deliver a knockout punch against a much larger foe. Today, classes like the American Cyclone-class patrol coastal or the Swedish combat boat 90 continue the mission profile pioneered by the PT boats: coastal patrol, interdiction, and support for special operations. Their most profound legacy is one of concept. The PT boat demonstrated the critical importance of asymmetric warfare. It proved that a technologically and numerically superior force could be effectively harassed and contained by a determined opponent using the right tools and tactics. For the environment, they were a masterclass in leveraging agility, surprise, and local knowledge against brute strength. The story of the PT boat is not just a tale of a wooden warship. It is a timeless lesson in military adaptation, a testament to the idea that innovation and courage can, and often must, triumph over sheer mass and power. The wooden warriors are gone, but the spirit of the Mosquito Fleet, the willingness to challenge giants with a slingshot, lives on wherever ingenuity meets impossible odds. They were born of desperation and built of wood, designed to be expendable. Yet, the PT boats carved their name into history not with the mass of their hulls, but with the weight of their impact. From the doomed waters of the Philippines to the dark straits of the Solomons, they became the persistent sting in the side of a naval empire, proving that speed and courage could be a shield, and that a well-aimed torpedo or a hailstorm of cannon fire could humble a giant. They were more than just boats. They were a declaration that no domain, however dominated by the enemy, was beyond challenge. The wake of their passing has long since smoothed, but the legend of the wooden warriors endures a timeless echo of a war won not only by industrial might, but by the audacity of those who dared to go into the night in boats of wood and come out swinging. The story of the PT boats is a powerful reminder that history is filled with underdog stories waiting to be rediscovered. If you want to explore more tales of incredible courage and tactical genius against impossible odds, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We rely on your support to bring these vital stories to light. Let us know in the comments which other asymmetric warfare stories you'd like us to cover next.